To say that China's naval conflicts in the early to mid-19th century had not gone well is an understatement on the scale of saying that Yamato's attempt to execute Operation Tengo perhaps hadn't entirely fulfilled its objectives. This was compounded by the new and rapidly industrialising Japan that was buying ironclad warships from the British. This presented something of a problem since Japan's favourite enemy at this point in history, after of course other Japanese clans, was China. The Chinese government therefore enacted their own plan of industrialisation, called the Self-Strengthening Plan, and formed 4 distinct fleets, of which the Beiyang Fleet, the most newly formed and the most northerly, would receive most of the available funding, since this was the fleet closest to Japan and the potentially contested territories. Since China lacked the ability to build modern warships for themselves, they began ordering them from Europe instead, much as Japan was doing. Initially, these orders primarily came from Britain, who was, by this point, the kind of shady arms dealer in a long trench coat found in a dark alley of the world, except they had ironclad battleships in their pockets rather than firearms. As time went on, the Chinese shipyards began to make their own gunboats and other smaller vessels, and so larger ships were ordered from overseas. But for political reasons, at the end of the 1870s, whilst Britain would happily sell them a cruiser or two, they didn't want to sell them any battleships. Since orders had recently been placed with Germany as well, mainly for torpedo boats, the Chinese government then asked the Germans if they'd be willing to build them some battleships instead. Contracts were quickly signed, and although limited funds meant that the planned fleet was soon reduced until eventually only 2 ships would actually be built, these 2 ships did have their keels laid, named Dingyuan and Zenyuan. Laid down in 1881 and 1882 respectively, they were both launched in the same year as their keels were laid, and commissioned in 1883 and 1884. The ships were armed with a main battery of 4 12-inch guns in a pair of twin barbettes placed en echelon forward. A number of contemporary foreign sketches got the order of the guns the wrong way round, but from the photos of the ships it's possible to establish that it was the starboard mounting that was the leading one. Since quick-firing guns were still almost a decade away from widespread deployment, the secondary battery was made up of just 2 single 5.9-inch guns, one fore and one aft. A number of 47mm and 37mm guns for anti-torpedo boat work were scattered throughout the ship's masts and superstructure, along with a trio of above-water torpedo launchers, 2 forward and 1 aft. The main guns also had a splinter-proof only all-around shield, which does make them look like turrets in many photos, but this did not actually make them turrets by the definition of the time, which would require substantial armour. The ship's actual armour was made up of a compound belt 14 inches thick, with 12 inches of armour on the barbettes and 3 inches of armour on the deck. They could reach just over 15 knots, as the power plant exceeded expectations and proved capable of just over 7,000 indicated horsepower, on a displacement of just over 7,000 tons under normal load conditions. Part of the reason for the main battery being positioned so far forward was that the ships also carried a pair of small torpedo boats, which were located just aft of the funnels. Although this decision meant that the ships tended to trim quite a bit by the bows, since the weight of the main battery and its armour was considerably more than that of a pair of small light torpedo craft and a few cranes. Somewhat delayed entering service due to China getting into a minor war with France and Germany having a policy at the time of not supplying warships to a country that was actively at war, the 2 battleships finally entered Chinese service in 1885. However, it turned out China had bought a pair of ships so large they didn't actually have the dry docks to maintain them, which meant semi-regular voyages to either British-owned Hong Kong or, of all places, Japan, the very country they'd been built to counter and or intimidate. That latter bit went about as well as expected, one visit resulting in several riots and the Chinese fleet being banned from Japanese ports. After almost a decade in service, what's now called the First Sino-Japanese War broke out, leaving the Chinese fleets in a somewhat odd position. Redirected funds had meant no updates had been done to the ships, and in the late 19th century, a ship that had been laid down almost 15 years earlier was considered hopelessly obsolete for frontline service. But at the same time, the Japanese had shifted their fleet over to a jeune école model, with a heavy emphasis on torpedo boats and cruisers. Thus, when the still somewhat confusing Battle of the Yalu River unfolded, the somewhat poorly supplied and technically outdated ironclads sat in the middle of the Chinese battle line and proceeded to weather hundreds of shells from the Japanese fleet, with no noticeable effect on their ability to remain afloat or fire back, their thick armour more than able to withstand the small caliber shell fire. In fact, the worst damage was self-inflicted, as Dingyuan reportedly destroyed its own flying bridge with the blast of her main battery, whilst the occasional firing of both ships' 12-inch guns did manage to badly damage some of the Japanese warships. With the Beiyang fleet reduced to just the 2 ironclads and a few minor warships, it withdrew, with Zenyuan managing to hit a reef just over a month later, which did far more damage to her than the Japanese Navy had managed. The next year, in February 1895, the 2 ships found themselves defending Weihai Wei from a combined land and sea attack by the Japanese. During this battle, Japanese torpedo boats managed to get into the harbour and scored a single torpedo hit on Dingyuan, which was run aground to prevent her from sinking. With the combination battle-siege coming to an end and Dingyuan rendered unsalvageable, she was destroyed by a large amount of explosives of some nature being detonated amidships, but not her main magazines. Whilst Zenyuan was captured by the Japanese Navy, who took her into service as their first true battleship and renamed her Qinyan. Modernised to the extent that was possible, Qinyan was rapidly displaced in the Japanese Navy's pecking order by the arrival of pre-dreadnought battleships, but she stayed in active service, taking part in the Russo-Japanese War and seeing action at both the battles of Yellow Sea and Tsushima, thereafter helping to bring still more captured ships, this time Russian, into Japanese service. After the war, she was repurposed as a training ship until 1911, when she was briefly used as a target ship and then sold for scrap in 1912. Dingyuan, meanwhile, has made a slightly unexpected comeback, with the Chinese government building a replica of her in the early 2000s, which is apparently now open to visitors if you want to risk heading over there.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.